Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Legal Systems Lecture, Part 2. So, we're going to continue our discussion about the types of courts. In the previous lecture, we talked about juvenile courts, and now we'll be talking about domestic relations court, the criminal court, and the civil court. The domestic relations court deals with marriage and child rearing issues. The court assumes that parents are fit and proper, that is, they know what's best for their children. So things get a bit awkward when parents bring up maltreatment allegations about their spouse and partner. Um, yeah, they usually try to get custody of the child through this, and each parent can get their own expert or professional to testify about who's best suited to get the child. So, based on this information, what do you think is the difference between domestic relations and juvenile court? Why don't you pause now and think about it? Well, it's different because the parents in this case are opening up the case and it's not the CPS or the state. So the limitations of the domestic relations court is that the parents have to use their own resources. So the quality of the evidence they provide is dependent on um, how wealthy they are. Another one is that the children are maybe asked to testify in front of their parents. And the process is already stressful as it is, but then they might be asked difficult questions in court in front of their parents, such as who would you rather live with? And there's sometimes multiple assessments done on a child. Um, Parents may summon professionals from both sides, and there may be too many assessments for the child to take, and they might become fatigued. And there's usually no legal representation for the child. The child is basically on their own. It's only in special cases where the child gets legal protection. And the court lacks the ability to follow up with decisions, and it's usually up to the parent to enforce the court's decisions. So, for example, if a parent is not paying child support, the other parent has the responsibility of going to court and telling the court about the lack of child support. So, next up is criminal cases, and this involves the most serious consequence, which is imprisonment. You don't frequently see child maltreatment cases in criminal court because people argue with the philosophy behind dealing with child maltreatment through punishment. Some say it helps bring justice to abusers, while others say it doesn't really get at the root of the problem, which is the parents' maltreating behavior. Um, you usually see you will see children you'll see child maltreatment cases in criminal court for more severe cases that involve severe permanent harm or death. The prosecutor brings up the charges, and child maltreatment charges can range from a misdemeanor to a felony. And the prosecutors can collaborate with law enforcement to bring up with the charges, and the law enforcement can collaborate with CPS. Because the outcomes are severe, the standard of proof is or above 95% chance. And I want to talk about the criminal procedure. This is more of a general step-by-step, a bit more broad. So the prosecutor brings the case to the grand jury, and then the grand jury determines whether there's enough evidence to formally charge the defendant. The prosecutor brings a case up to the grand jury. The grand jury determines whether there is enough evidence to formally charge the defendant with a crime with the preponderance of evidence standard. If the grand jury decides to formally charge the defendant, there is an arraignment. And during the arraignment, the defendant is told about the charges against them. Then the defendant enters a plea. They can decide to plead guilty to the charges or not plead guilty. The advantages of not pleading guilty is that they can change their decision later on, and usually the prosecutor tries to strike a bargain with the defendant to get them to plead guilty. Specifically, the prosecutor offers a lesser charge, which entails a lesser punishment in exchange from a guilty plea from the defendant. If the defendant decides the prosecution's case is weak, they may plead not guilty and take the case to trial. And during trial, the judges and the juries determine the truth from the prosecution and defense's cases, and they make a legal decision. In this case, it is a guilty or not guilty decision. If the defendant is found guilty, then they would go through. Then the judge would dole out a sentencing decision. So the criminal court may be the most stressful place of all for children, and the court can make some accommodations. So the Sixth Amendment allows the defendant to face the prosecutor's witnesses in court. But as you can imagine, if the witness was a child, they'd be under quite a bit of stress. So the Supreme Court has made an exception by allowing children to testify in a remote location through a CCTV. The Supreme Court has found this issue to be controversial in the past. The first time the use of CC was brought up in Supreme Court, the Supreme Court ruled against the use of CCTVs in Corey versus Iowa. But 2 years later, when another similar case was appealed up to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the use of CCTVs in the courtroom in the case of Maryland versus Craig, 1990. One of the other accommodations is that the court allows the child to give short testimonies with frequent breaks. And the court allows the environment to be changed a little for a child, so the child can maybe sit behind a small kid-sized table while testifying. And the court has allowed for some hearsay evidence in which a witness testifies about what a child has said. And there are two examples of that is the excited utterance and the tender years exception. So for the excited utterance, it allows witnesses to testify about things the child has said after witnessing a startling event. The logic is that the children don't lie when they are emotionally upset. For the tender years exception, witnesses are allowed to testify about things that a younger child under the age of 10 has said about sexual abuse. The logic is that children do not have the capacity to make up things about sexual abuse, so they're probably telling the truth. The court also allows dogs in the courtroom to comfort children when they testify. And there's a link to a video that basically describes how dogs are implemented in the courtroom. It's really cute. I suggest you watch it. So people have argued that the presence of a dog will prejudice jurors' decisions. However, the counter argument is that the dog can be placed out of sight so that the jury doesn't see that the dog is there. And here's a picture of a dog being out of sight, and the dog is sort of behind like a wooden block while the witness is testifying there. So there are limitations to the criminal courts. One of them is that families are torn apart. It's hard to reunite parents when the parents are in jail. And as I said before, imprisonment may not fix bad parenting behavior. And children are pretty stressed out throughout this whole process. So now I'm going to talk about civil courts. So if criminal court doesn't work, a party may sue for child maltreatment. Child maltreatment is linked with tort law, and tort law usually involves a conduct, product, or service that does not meet the acceptable minimum standards, which results in harm. When applied to child maltreatment, the parent in question has not reared the child to an acceptable standard, which has led to the harm of the child. And an adult can bring charges, civil charges on behalf of the child. And the standard of proof here is the preponderance of evidence greater than 50%. And the possible defendants are the state, and usually the state can be a defendant when the child is removed from the parent's care, and this removal results in some sort of harm. So possible defendants is the state. The state can become a defendant when the involuntary removal of a child from a parent's care results in some sort of harm. The offending parent can be a defendant. A non-offending parent can be a defendant when the parent could have stopped them or could have done something about the maltreatment but didn't. Insurance companies can be the target when the offending parent is poor, and professionals can be the targets of civil suits when they have failed to report child maltreatment. There are some limitations to civil cases. One of them is that there's not as many rights for the defendant. Defendant is not entitled to an attorney. Second is that the parents, again, have to use their own resources. So the author of your textbook, Monica McCoy, makes some suggestions for those who are in the field of child protection and are asked to testify in court. She recommends that these witnesses be serious and respectful, wear professional clothing, uh, not do not use slang to appear unprofessional, but do not use jargon to confuse people. Maintain a good posture. Have the testimony prepared. Think before answering. Do not guess what a question is. If you don't know, just say you don't know. And do not give an opinion unless told. So, in summary, domestic court deals with marriage and child rearing. Things get a bit awkward when parents bring a case against another, brings a child maltreatment case against another parent. The assumption is that the parents know what's best for their children. Maltreating is not in the best interest of the child. And the parents have to make an effort to enforce the decisions of the court. For the criminal court, it is for the more serious child maltreatment cases. Punishment is severe, so it requires the highest burden of proof and tends to be the most stressful for children, but there are ways that the court can accommodate children. Civil courts involve suing someone for child maltreatment. The logic is that the child rearing isn't up to an appropriate standard, which causes harm. The standard of proof, preponderance of evidence, is much more relaxed than the criminal standard. Finally, Monica McCoy offers some suggestions for testifying in court. The main theme is that the witness be professional in every respect in appearance and demeanor.